Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural talk for the Just Infrastructure Speaker Series. My name is Carrie Karahalios, and along with Anita Chan and Indy Gupta, my fellow colleagues of the Just Infrastructures Initiative, we will be your hosts for today's event.
For those of you who don't know us yet, Just Infrastructures is an initiative created by researchers to interrogate the complex interactions between people, algorithms, and AI-driven systems. You can learn more about us and see more information about our next event with Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein on data feminism on February 24th at our website at just-infras.illinois.edu. A link has been added to the chat. You can see our full spring calendar of talks there as well.
We want to thank our funders, the Computer Science Department, the School of Information Sciences, the Granger College of Engineering's SRI, Capital One, and the Community Data Clinic for supporting this programming. We have a long list of non-financial co-sponsors you can see on our website, who we also want to thank.
To ask a question, you can use the Q&A box. We will go through the questions at the end of the talk. Closed captioning and American Sign Language support is also available, and you can pin the interpreters. You can request any tech support also in the chat box. This talk is recorded.
I'd like to now ask you to join me in a land acknowledgement. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists and the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose lands it is located.
We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Vea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Acknowledgements invite us to ask, what does it mean to live in a post- and neo-colonial world? What did it take for us to get here? And how can we be accountable to our part in history?
We'd now like to turn over to our esteemed presenter. We are extremely honored to have Dr. Joan Donovan with us here today. Dr. Donovan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. She's a leading scholar of online extremism and disinformation campaigns, and her work has been showcased in a wide array of academic journals, as well as media outlets from the New York Times and the Washington Post to the Atlantic and Rolling Stone. At the Shorenstein Center, she leads workshops for scholars, journalists, technologists, and policymakers on how to detect and debunk media manipulation campaigns. And many of us know her voice from the wonderful Big If True podcast that she also produces from Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joan Donovan.
Let me unmute myself. Welcome everybody to Zoom University. I'll be your professor for this afternoon. I hope you've got a latte and a brown bag lunch. I'm just joking. I'm a big joker these days. Why not, right? Really excited to be here. And of course, the only regret I have is that we're not all together in the same room talking about this stuff and just kind of trying to understand where we are right now in terms of our technology, our democracy, our future, or, the relationship between people and things and ideas and concepts and laws and norms and contracts and all kinds of things. But today I'm going to talk to you about, the media manipulation. We're going to talk a little bit about some current events. We're going to talk a little bit about the ways in which the U.S. election 2020 was, sort of papered over by a very large and intricate disinformation campaign. I'm only going to go through a little piece of the big lie, but the goal here is actually to introduce you to our theory and methods, the way in which we think technology interacts with our media and how then that shapes political outcomes, but then also reciprocally, because I am a science and technology studies nerd, society, politics, the economy also shapes in a kind of co-productive way our technology. It's all intertwined. Big messy hairball, as my cat, who may bust in the room at any moment, would like us to know about. I want to say thank you, of course, to everybody that was so instrumental in getting this together. Anita, I've known for many years now, and when I got the invitation and it had the word infrastructure in it, I was just like, these are my people. We were joking before while we were doing the tech checkup about, when we talk about disinformation, what are we really even talking about? Well, we're talking about infrastructure. But infrastructure is not, to borrow from Susan Lee Starr, the infrastructure is very specifically a way of seeing the world, but it's also very boring. And so I participate, of course, in the study, as do some of you, the study of boring things. So here's my title slide, which is "What is Media Manipulation? How Disinformation Thrives in a Networked Media Ecosystem." And as you know, I'm Joan Donovan, but you can find me at manipulation@hks.harvard.edu, and you can find our research and theory and methods and most of what I'm going to present to you today at mediamanipulation.org, where I have a very wonderful and studious team of ethnographers and sociologists, political scientists, even a few lawyers, data scientists. It really takes a whole team to make sense of media manipulation. So let's go through a couple of definitions. So what do we mean when we talk about media manipulation, disinformation campaigns? Well, first, in a very Comms 101 part of the definition, media is an artifact of communication. So it could be a book, it could be a movie, could be a JPEG, could be an MP3. Remember MP3s? Those were cool. Everybody's all stuck with these subscription services these days, but I used to like to have a hard copy. Certain bands, they're my favorite band. I want to have all their MP3s. No, I'm joking. But it could be a record, it could be a CD, right? Any kind of artifact of communication is sort of what we study, and how we study how it travels through the world, be it through the net or through meat space, which is our fleshy bodies. And then manipulation, though, we have a definition where we talk about it as to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. And that's a really important definition for us as a team, because sometimes media manipulation is not all bad. Sometimes hackers or activists might use media manipulation tactics to illuminate certain issues, to shed light on, to show how broken a system or an infrastructure is. So in that case, we leave artful in there so that it can be, so that we can have a very flexible, but still workable definition of media manipulation. And then we hold out disinformation in a very particular way as a very special subcategory of media manipulation, where we are talking about the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. So today I'm going to present to you some disinformation, but I think it's important that you understand these distinctions, where misinformation is just false ideas or false things that are being shared, but it doesn't have intentionality baked into it, and it sometimes doesn't have to have a political end. For instance, misinformation could be medical misinformation, that like someone says, hey, you probably got that COVID chain letter that went around early in the pandemic that said, just drink a little bit of water every 15 minutes and you'll be fine. Thanks. Signed off as Stanford. And then, of course, Stanford had to come out and say, wait, we didn't say that. And also, like, what? So, sometimes people will hide misinformation behind credentials that are difficult to vet or to double check. But disinformation, though, is something that when we study it and we call something disinformation, it's because it meets this specific definitional criteria. So the other element of what we're going to talk about today is something that I wrote about a couple years ago with my co-author and colleague Brian Friedberg, called source hacking, which is a tactic where groups coordinate to feed disinformation to journalists and experts, usually during breaking news cycles. So one of the very first times I started thinking about source hacking was actually during the moments right after a very tragic event, the Parkland school shooting. And one of the things that we know about media manipulators is when there is a breaking news moment, that's when they get very excited and kind of jump into action. And so we were researching about internet fringe subcultures, white nationalists, and this event happened, and it was very jarring. Immediately we knew there was going to be misinformation. We knew there were going to be trolls. We knew there were going to be white supremacists. Everybody volleying for attention. And so one of the things that happened very quickly was there was a picture put up on an anonymous message board, which, many of us already know of 4chan, but if you don't, it's just an anonymous message board. It's a very fast and loose kind of infrastructure where it's organized around certain subtopics, but there's a board on 4chan called POL, which stands for politically incorrect, where lots of trolls and other kind of folks like to agitate and like to actually hoax the media, and they'll get organized over there in order to trick journalists. So this day was similar in the sense that there was a media opportunity. Someone posted a picture of a young man with his face covered, claiming that it was the suspect in the school shooting, and that this picture was actually of him being part of this Republic of Florida militia. Now, at that time, a lot of us had seen that picture, but nobody could substantiate who it was because it was a masked figure. However, journalists were poking around asking any old expert who they thought it was and if they thought it was real. And unfortunately, someone from the ADL did confirm that this was true. And it was because they had gotten the same information and saw it on 4chan and thought it was real and told a journalist it was real. In the background as well, people were lacing fake comments on the Instagram of the suspect. They were putting up, they had made what appears to be a fake chat room log saying that, basically saying some terrible things and saying that they were going to go commit some kind of crime in the future. And so there were all these different pieces and elements that were being fed to journalists in the background, so that when journalists came out, the first journalist to come out and say, I can confirm that this is in fact Nikolas Cruz, it just caused this cascade in the media, and everybody was quoting that initial story. And for the next several hours, many people believed that Nikolas Cruz was a white supremacist member of this Republic of Florida militia. And of course, this just made the trolls laugh. And sometimes that's the point. They just are here for the lulz. They're here for some chaos. And we've seen that practice of hacking the source material over and over and over and over again. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about how that kind of tactic scales, especially in the midst of an election where journalists are looking for particular kinds of stories. And so it actually tilts in favor of manipulators to be able to give them what they want. And journalists, of course, are no stranger to getting hoaxed, no stranger to getting soft PR. PR firms often employ journalists. And so it shouldn't be surprising that this is a bit of an adversarial relationship. But nevertheless, journalists are under incredible pressure to get stories out quickly because of the effect of being there's a money to be had if you are first. And so that is really important to understand, that the demands on journalists are not just wanting to be first, but also their popularity, the popularity of the story, their livelihoods are at stake. And as a result, journalists are not necessarily getting it wrong on purpose, although some who are nefarious and know why they would get it wrong on purpose to meet political ends, why they would do that. But most journalists are faithfully trying to get things right, but also trying to get them done fast. And of course, there's a huge trade-off between accuracy and speed, as we know from STS research. So here's an example of two different tactics of source hacking that happened at once. So the Parkland shooting, of course, this is a picture of Emma Gonzalez, who was one of the survivors of that offense. And in an interview with Teen Vogue, she's seen ripping a Target in half. And this picture was in the lead up to the big March for Our Lives event that was happening in DC, where there were distributed and networked protests all over the United States of students who were saying, we don't want any more gun violence. We do not want guns in our school. And so what we are going to do is get together, rally, lobby Congress. And Emma Gonzalez was, a kind of key figure in the movement, not necessarily as famous as David Hogg, but definitely one of the most impassioned speakers, and very well, I got very high engagement on social media. So this picture that you see on the side here of her ripping up this Target, on the eve of the big March for Our Lives, again, trolls on 4chan start to manipulate that image with Photoshop and other software. And what they do is they change the target to the Constitution. They darken her eyes, they widen her nose, they change the color of her skin, they make her ears a little bit bigger, they change just a lot of features that make her, in this other picture, make her seem ominous or more scary, or potentially, on drugs. And they're all talking about it in this thread as their people are offering up other versions of this picture. So they're all talking and kind of co-editing and co-constructing the media manipulation campaign as it happens. And they're laughing along, saying, oh yeah, tomorrow when there's the march, we'll throw this on Twitter. And the plan was to hijack the hashtag. And so keyword squatting, that is getting in on a particular keyword so that you can lace the social media terrain with media manipulation or disinformation artifacts, right, is really the like, this is the operation. This is the thing that they're doing. This is the activism of these groups. This is them showing their political intent. A lot of them are ardent supporters of the Second Amendment, which they believe means that they should be able to have, any kind of gun. Some of them, I'm sure, would be happy to say we should have missiles or whatever it is. If we can afford it, we should own it. And this is also a place where people have discussed at length and shared at length the blueprint for the 3D printed gun, which has been very controversial as a piece of digital weaponry, right? This idea that you can print a gun with a 3D printer and actually have it fire ammunition. So this is all happening within the same context. So one of the ways that we were able to find this post and find all the places that people were trafficking this manipulated image was simply by using reverse image search. We used TinEye, Tineye. And then we followed the event on Twitter, and we just kept a rolling collection of every time we saw the image, we would take a screenshot, because sometimes manipulators are really savvy and they know that it doesn't it doesn't help them to keep disinformation on their accounts very long. And so what they do is they will put it up for a couple hours and then delete it. And so that kind of tactic makes it actually harder for platform companies or trust and safety teams to even assess the damage that they're causing. So that's one example of a cheap fake, which is just, regular old manipulation of regular old editing. There's been a lot of talk about deep fakes and AI and all of this, but you don't really need all of that in order to accomplish a media manipulation campaign. In fact, we see cheap fakes often, and they still tend to work. They do the job. And so the idea that you would need something more sophisticated in order to pull off a manipulation campaign is just not, it's just not entirely necessary. Of course, as we see AI develop and Daniel Citron and Marianne Franks talk about non-consensual image sharing, we will see people want to make more and more realistic looking fakes, especially if they are to be used in harassment campaigns or blackmail campaigns or even political disinformation campaigns, usually where women or people of color are the target, because there's a way in which disinformation about and harassment of women candidates and candidates of color in politics tend to draw in these kinds of media manipulation techniques. And it's a really interesting and fruitful line of research that I am excited that a few colleagues are starting to embark on. So let's do a little bit of theory, because can't dispense without it. And it's sort of my favorite thing these days. This is a book, Two Bits, written by Chris Kelty over at UCLA. It's called, the subtitle is The Cultural Significance of Free Software. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is the relationship, infrastructurally between the production of moral and technical order, right? There's the idea that these two things are produced at the same time. So he writes, geeks fashion together both technology and principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, an imagination of the proper order of collective political and commercial action, that is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. And I bring your attention to that because we are in the midst of a moment where the technology companies that are, the big Silicon Valley ones, especially though Facebook and Twitter, are largely run by founders who have an imagination about how they believe technology and commerce should work together, and especially how they understand politics in this moment, related to a very US, United States ideology around the proper ordering of free speech, as well as the proper relationship between freedom and regulation, or you could say even content and censorship. However they want to frame the problem, though, I think we all know that the problem is really one of infrastructure. So when I was, and infrastructure and who controls it, I should say, and communication infrastructure is society made durable in many ways, to borrow a phrase from Latour, half the phrase anyway. I wrote this piece, Weaponizing the Digital Influence Machine, a few years back with Matt Crane and Tony Nadler about the political perils of online ad tech. So at this time, it was before we had any congressional hearings, specifically about Russian targeting of US-based social movements during the election. When people talk about Russian meddling in the US election back in 2016, they're, if you talk to political scientists, they're going to be like, it didn't do anything. It didn't make anybody vote differently. And that's my impression of a political scientist, because you can tell I've had it up to here with these guys. And that's because who was targeted by Russian meddling, as it's come to be known, is social movements. It was, they pretended to be anti-Muslim groups and pro-Muslim groups. They pretended to be a trans teenager, mad at their parents, but then also mad at the government. They pretended to be Black Lives Matter groups, right? And so the kind of influence then that they were seeking to have wasn't necessarily pro Donald Trump, although it certainly was anti Hillary Clinton. The kind of influence they sought was more cultural. It was about culture and about confusion and about creating anxiety, about splitting coalitions, about making any kind of nuance an impossible discussion to have. So we wrote this piece and we talk about this as the digital influence machine, which is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. Which is to say that Facebook doesn't end at Facebook. When you get off of Facebook and you go to another website, there are things in the infrastructure that follow you. It's like a many-armed octopus, or however you want to describe it. But we don't talk about the web in this way. We don't focus the web on advertising infrastructure. Of course, Sophia Noble's brilliant book on algorithms of oppression really does drive this point home, which is to say that these companies' power does not stop necessarily with you clicking on the app or the website. It's all throughout your devices. And then also, even when you're not speaking back to it, sometimes it's still communicating back to these companies, either your computer or most likely your telephone. That all being said, then when we start to think about, well, there's a construction of social order going on here. There's an infrastructure that's built to support it. And yet social media is free, right? So the whole adage about, when the product is free, you are the product. Cool. We know that. Like, that's pretty normal. Okay, I get it. You want me to drive down the highway? I'm going to see a few billboards. Like, sometimes that's the thing that needs to happen. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. However, when companies are allowed to get so big and so unwieldy and have their technology essentially be the infrastructure of everyday life, then we have to wonder, well, are we paying too much? Are we giving over too much? What are the limits on this data collection? And how much are they going to be able to sell back to me? And so it's really about the way we are being ordered, the way we are being interpolated into these systems that's at stake. Because to be honest with you, nobody asked if they could collect big data. They just did it, right? And so even Shana Zuberoff's most recent op-ed in the Times points out that this was a heist. The stuff you're seeing with Wall Street Bets last week, that's just a smash and grab on capitalism. But the big data was a heist. But one of the things I want to tune in and take the next 15 minutes to wrap up here to say is basically that we're in this situation, and I want to show you how it plays out politically then, when we have no guardrails and no way to rail in misinformation when it starts to reach scale. So Zuckerberg, of course, October 2019, he goes to a university in DC, and we know who hangs out at universities in DC, right? Like, no big surprise why he wasn't at Stanford, because, everybody knows the politicians hang out at Stanford, right? No. So he figures out how to get to DC. I don't know if he's got a hoverboard or if he's got like his own space, jet or however he travels these days. Maybe it's just a pod that dematerializes him, and then like Mike TV, he comes out of television screens and other places. Who knows what technology he's the magician for? But he says this very banal statement. He says, "I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy." Yeah, I don't think so either. Like, I guess, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that's pretty flat statement. And then he goes on, of course, to reinvent the history of Facebook, suggesting that it was actually a reaction to the war that was going on. And he wanted to make sure people had a place to discuss that so that they didn't, feel isolated and alone. In that moment. And of course, that betrays the entire history that we know of Facebook, which was essentially a website put together to rate women on a scale of pretty much, hot or not. And so that makes me suspect of somebody's intents here when they say, well, I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy. And then I think, well, what service are you providing that politician? And in doing so, have ensured that regulation doesn't befall your corporation. And of course, there's also a longer history of what's good for social justice is good for social media that has prevented us as a nation in the U.S. from doing any kind of reform around Section 230, which now that I've said it, the free speech lawyers are going to descend like the hounds of hell on my house. And so I only have 10 minutes to live, which is really unfortunate. But I say that just because there's also a kind of lawyerly set that hears the words 230 and has a very specific reason and way of engaging with Congress that ensures that nothing happens. And so the second thing, though, that comes up in January 2020, which is pretty important here, is how that idea gets enshrined in corporate policy, which is in a blog post where they tend to kind of like litter these blog posts with updates to their terms of service. He says, in the absence of regulation, Facebook and other companies are left to design their own policies. Yeah, that's true. And he says, we've based ours on the principle that people should be able to hear from those who wish to lead them, warts and all. So this policy actually created a carve out for politicians to be able to say whatever they want, to use Facebook's targeted advertising tools in any capacity that they wanted, and that Facebook was going to perform no extra fact checking, no extra oversight. And because ads on social media are considered small items like baseball hats or bumper stickers, even though it's a multi-million-dollar business, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense why you would have that carve out, but okay. So basically, Facebook says we're going to do nothing, but we know politicians are trolls. We know they're odorous. We know that warts and all, to me, says that they know that politicians are going to act in bad faith. And of course, what that does is Elizabeth Warren jumps in, puts out an ad with some fake content, and then makes a show of it saying, hey, look at what I can do now, basically portending what was to come in the future. So when we study this, I'm going to go over this briefly so that you have it in your minds. But when I talk to some of you students later, we can go into this more deeply about the method for studying media manipulation and disinformation campaigns. But we've got the media manipulation casebook. Baked into it is a set of theories and methods about how manipulation happens, what the tactics are. And we basically look for 5 points of action when we want to understand how manipulators are achieving their ends, which is spreading their campaigns at scale. So we look at manipulation campaign planning and origins. We look at how they're seeding the campaign across social platforms and web. Number 3 is actually where we find most manipulation campaigns. So don't be deluded that like we somehow have this, special AI or machine learning that can tell us where this stuff existed before. We basically find out about manipulation campaigns when they start to work. That is, when people respond to them. Because in that response isn't just the legitimacy of industry activists, politicians, or journalists, but it's also their audiences, and it's also the algorithms then that respond to that engagement. And say Offit from New Georgia Project said the other day in a meeting, she said, algorithms don't care about your analysis. And that is very true. Okay. So once people start engaging with manipulated content, it starts to show up in recommendations, it starts to show up in search. And so the goal of most media manipulators is just to get to stage 3, which is to get noticed and to get engaged with. Oh, sorry, ended up going the wrong way. And then stage 4, mitigation, platform companies doing something about it, maybe, and then or journalists debunking it, and then part 5 is, of course, manipulators' adjustments. So I'm going to describe to you a tactic called distributed amplification, which is a call to participants to rapidly and widely spread campaign materials, including propaganda or disinformation. Distributed amplification relies on many campaign participants to individually share sensitive or banned content on their personal social media accounts in an effort to evade platform mitigation efforts or to dominate the information ecosystem with repetitive content. So on one side of your screen, you see a beautiful beach, and that is Barbara Streisand's house. And this was part of an ecological report by the California government. And Barbara Streisand wanted her picture of her house removed. The report was about this kind of erosion that you're seeing here. And this effect of her asking for it to be removed and then people online distributing it en masse became later known as the Streisand effect. And we saw this happen again when Tom Cruise wanted a video from Scientology removed from video platforms. As the more that Scientology tried to get it removed, the more Anonymous and other activists uploaded it. So distributed amplification has been with us as a tactic for a pretty long time, and sometimes can be used by activists, but other times it's used by media manipulators. So let's get into a case. Back on October 14th, which feels like 6 years ago, but it wasn't that long ago, that there was this New York Post article about Biden's secret emails. I don't know a lot of emails that aren't secret. And I'll tell you, I get a lot of email. I don't want to read anybody else's email. That's just not spicy for me. Right. There's just not a lot there. Okay. Yeah. I'll be there. Oh yeah. You want 2:30? Oh, send a pizza. Okay. Yeah. No, no more with this emails. And they had tried a few different times to make Biden, Hunter Biden, the story that would destabilize Joe Biden's campaign. And it just wasn't hitting. And so what they did was they colluded with the New York Post, and this is Steve Bannon and Giuliani, to drop this story on Wednesday, October 14th. And the idea was simple: get the story out there and let the internet do its worst, right? So in the morning, the paper comes out, and then at 9:06 a.m. you get the tweets and the Facebook posts saying, "Never before revealed meeting is mentioned in a message of appreciation that Vadam, an advisor to the board of Burisma, allegedly sent Hunter Biden." And then you've got, Kennedy, right? I don't know if you remember her from her MTV days, but she's on Fox with Mayor Giuliani, where Giuliani is ripping. I mean, he's mad. He wants everybody to look at these emails. And if you look at these emails, they're not that interesting. It's a lot of can you send this? Did you get that kind of stuff? But it's not that spicy. And we've actually, had and saw those emails in the past. But What they've done though is online paired them with this laptop story that Hunter Biden had gone to a small mom and pop shop in DC to drop off his broken laptop, and that he was going to pay like $85 to have the hard drive, the contents of the hard drive put onto another hard drive. And over time, though, unfortunately, he never went back to go get this laptop. So the owner of the repair shop just decided to, well, maybe I'll take a look at the files, see if there's an address or a way to get in touch with the owner of this laptop. And he does, he takes a peek inside, and what he finds is crimes, like actual crimes, in the fact that there are supposedly pictures of Hunter Biden doing drugs, and also lots of homemade pornography. And then also thousands of emails with email exchanges where some very deep cuts are evidence of crimes. So this, down on his luck, trying to get this $85 computer repairman decides, well, I should call the FBI and let them know that I have this laptop. Now, of course, all of our senses as media manipulation researchers are like on high here. Our ears are on fire, our fingers and our fists are balling up, because we know this is a hack and leak operation. This laptop didn't just show up in DC. You don't think Hunter Biden can afford a home visit for crimes and pornography? Like, come on. Even I can afford a repairman to come to my house if I have such sensitive information. So it hits the internet like like a hurricane, and something different happens. So they're depending upon it being able to be circulated very widely, but then the platform companies and others start to take actions. So there's a bunch of memes, and this is the reaction phase. Guess who's not getting a laptop for Christmas this year? Ha ha. Holy Bobolinsky Batman, the emails found on the Hunter Biden laptop prove that Joe Biden, shut up, Robin, or Facebook or Twitter will erase both of us. And this is because, Andy Stone, who's a Facebook, he's a Facebook employee, but he ironically tweets his responses about what Facebook is doing. I guess it's not ironically, that's a bad use of that word. Anyway, so he tweets, well, I will intentionally not link to the New York Post. I want to be clear. This story is eligible to be fact-checked by Facebook's third-party fact-checking partners. In the meantime, we are reducing its distribution on our platform. And so people are like, what? Okay, you're going to reduce its distribution on its platform. So I went and pulled the data. And by that time, it already had been shared 500,000 times. That's a huge story, even if it was, for the New York Times. Like, that is a very large story. As well, on Twitter, what they did was they put a warning up, what's called an interstitial, and is now, if you want to share it, you get this interstitial, and if you want to click on it, you get this warning that says it contains certain categories of content. Later on that night, though, as things start to become more clear, Jack tweets this: our communication around our actions in the New York Post article was not great, and blocking URL sharing via tweet or DM with zero context as to why we're blocking, unacceptable. So he kind of threw his employees under the bus because they didn't have very clear policies on what's going to happen. Like, you'd think you'd have a pre-written press release very ready to go that's plug and play, like, we don't share hacked materials, or, there are images here that are non-consensual nudity, like, we're not going to play party to that. But instead, what we got was, especially Jack later in a congressional hearing, really trying to walk it back, saying we should have just allowed the New York Post article to circulate. And of course, this is because the ways in which liability play out on the web is that Twitter and Facebook are going to get a free pass anyway. Liability is always going to fall on the person or the organization sharing that material. So New York Post was always going to be on the hook for libelous or defamatory content, which is why you see Sidney Powell and others being sued by Dominion Voting Systems. It's because they said it. So therefore they're liable. So in wrapping up, as we were thinking about this as a case study, what we had to understand, and there was a big missing piece until Ben Smith of the New York Times came through and told the story from the perspective of mainstream media. This story of the New York Post would likely been circulated and recirculated and picked up by the mainstream press very quickly if we hadn't had so many source hacking attempts that tried to make journalists be the amplifiers of disinformation. So in this article, Ben Smith just lays it out that the White House had gone to the Wall Street Journal with this material. The Wall Street Journal could not verify it. Therefore, they wrote a tiny stub that basically said, people are alleging this about Hunter Biden. We can't verify it. This angered Giuliani and Bannon, who had been sort of the masterminds behind this last, I guess the first big lie here, which is to say that the Biden laptop was newsworthy. So they took it to the New York Post. And even in videos of Giuliani later, he's kind of smiling, saying, well, we knew they didn't really have, the editorial standards, like we knew they'd take it. And then it also shows us, too, that the way in which the White House was trying to plant disinformation into the media ecosystem right before a debate in the lead up to the mass election, that was kind of fumbled. And in fumbling it, that hack and leak operation didn't really have the impact that they wanted. Nevertheless, it did cause a lot of confusion and a lot of mistrust in the system. So I wrap up by saying, like secondhand smoke, misinformation damages the quality of public life. Every conspiracy theory, every propaganda or disinformation campaign affects people. And the expense of not responding can grow exponentially over time. Since the 2016 US election, newsrooms, technology companies, civil society organizations, politicians, educators, and researchers have been working to quarantine the viral spread of misinformation. The true costs have been passed on to them and to the everyday folks who rely on social media to get news and information. So I want to say thank you to everybody for listening to this. Sorry, going on a little bit long here. And thank you to my team members as well. And let's get to some Q&A. I can see there's a bunch, so someone else is going to shuffle them for me.
There is a great queue of questions right now. Thank you, Joan. We have time for some Q&A, and you can send us your questions in the Q&A box. Indy Gupta is going to be moderating those questions, and he's going to read aloud our first questions.
All right. Thank you, Joan. We have about 17 questions in the Q&A, 18 now, and probably climbing. I'll try to get through them in the order that they were posted. I might deviate a little bit. The first question is from William White. He asks, are there any technical qualifications you recommend for aspiring disinformation scholars?
Get a fast router. I don't know. You just need the bandwidth. I mean, I was just talking on a call yesterday with Kate Starbird, who is like an amazing data scientist. And we were just riffing on, what's happening in this field. And she says, well, what we found out is that if you just have someone watching about 500 known accounts, you can pretty much predict what kind of disinformation is going to spread and what isn't. And I just kind of laughed as a qualitative researcher and said, well, that's our method. And that's how we've been doing it for the last several years. We haven't had to build anything sophisticated or anything inherently like skill-based that would require any kind of technical specificity. And I think that one of the things this field is sort of suffers from in a lot of ways, because people think it's hard to do this work, is that you think that the technology is going to fix itself. This is a socio-technical problem, which is to say there are people and there are elements of the technology that when they come together, they produce different configurations or possibilities, political possibilities. And so if you know how technologies work and you know how they can be layered together and remixed, you can get an idea or an approximation about how they may coordinate, small groups may coordinate to have big impacts. Good example is the Wall Street bets moment, where you have now stocks of data from stocks. You have data sets from the Wall Street about how these stocks performed, some information about who bought them, who profited, matched with data in, of course, Reddit, where people were talking about how to get in on GameStop early. The big advantage is if you can watch these things play out in real time and capture that data either through technological means and scrape it, or screenshots. Like on January 6th, we had, there were 6 of us in a couple of different Google Docs just screenshotting everything, because we knew it was going to disappear. And we wanted the whole piece, right? We want, because we knew that if we were using certain technologies, like, Twitter scraping gets you the ID, but if the tweet goes down, then you lose the actual data. And so we were really trying to stay ahead of it, but it's an intensely hands-on field. So you have to kind of pick a lane, pick a scene, that is like pick a set of actors and behaviors and content and platforms, and then go deep on that. And I'm happy to come back and do a training for graduate students and professors that want to learn how to do this work very specifically, sort of the nuts and bolts. And we also have a investigative digital ethnography primer on mediamanipulation.org that lays it out really clearly about how do you set up your browser, how do you set up your accounts, and then you let the algorithms do the work. Like, this is the big, sort of the big pain point here, is that once you start following a few white supremacists or media manipulators, then, the algorithm will recommend you more. It's that simple.
Okay, the next question is from Jody Schneider, who asks, how does this kind of research work with terms of service that require removing content that individuals have posted or removed?
So in terms of things that have been posted or removed, so we don't publish data sets, and we make sure that in our case studies, if you see what we have published, what we publish is of public note. And then we also try to link back to journalism of the moment that also has more context and more evidence in it. But by and large, the evidence that we collect, we try to collect real time, and we do not share entire data sets. You'll see in our stock of evidence, the point isn't to go after anonymous, like in dox people or bring in people that that aren't already known. Disinformation at scale is a problem of elites. It's it's not always just this mid-level troll groups. What's interesting is actually the interaction between those troll groups, and then when a celebrity retweets them, or when a journalist retweets them. And that's really where we mark the significance of a campaign. But by and large, and I'm doing an event in an hour about amplification and hate, which I can get the link for you. It's on the internet. It's on medium.com/big if true. But in that event, I will be talking to a couple of activists that do seek out deleted content, especially when people have deleted evidence of crimes, because recovery of that information is really important. And I think, I wrote about this with Gabby Lim in Foreign Policy, moments like the January 6th actually point to a need for archival evidence lockers, so a human rights locker that should be available to investigators, researchers who want to look at, well, what happened online during the Capitol siege.
Okay, the next question is from Noel Brindis, who asks, do we think deepfakes will actually defeat themselves in the end? If we end up in a society where deepfakes are very common, I'd imagine people would stop trusting all apparent proof since anything could be faked.
Yes and no. I feel like, we're in this moment. There's a great paper by Tal Golan at UCSD that I read in grad school that I often go back to about X-rays. So X-rays, it's early technology, and you can imagine someone wants to go to court to sue their boss because they broke their hand at work, and the boss is like, well, how do I even know your hand's broken? And this new technology, X-rays, exist. And the history article really goes through how X-ray technicians became experts, like, because you needed to bring in then some specialists that could read the X-ray to be able to say, yes, this is what a broken bone looks like in an X-ray. And so there are ways in which it's important that we retain things as evidence. And it's important that we have a category around evidence for legal means so that people can get justice, right? However, I think there will be what Danielle Citron calls the liar's dividend, which is that it's always going to benefit media manipulators or people in power to say, well, that's a deep fake. That's not me. I never said that. And the more sophisticated the technology gets, of course, the more difficult it is going to be to detect deep fakes. And so companies that are building this technology are trying to invest in detection software as well, like trying to make the product in such a way that it leaves behind some digital signatures that can be detected, and then you can figure out if this is actually a deep fake or not. But it's a tricky one, and it's going to be really difficult because many people from my generation right now, from the last time I talked to a technologist, you only need about 30 pictures of someone's face in order to make a very convincing deep fake video of them. And so as a result, what that looks like is, people from my day, we got lots of selfies online. I'm from the selfie generation. So, deep faking me is not that hard. I'm hoping that other kinds of digital defense comes into play, and that people are, I hope that there are technologists out there that are thinking about, well, how do I ensure that my child's digital identity is safe from extortion or safer from extortion than than people from my generation who are like, digitize all the things. I have time for one more question, unfortunately.
Right. So we'll do one last question. And thank you to everyone who has posted questions. We apologize we couldn't get through all the questions due to time. I'll jump a little bit ahead in the order and ask the question by Jorge Rojas Alvarez, who asks, how do you suggest higher education institutions promote prevention of media manipulation for their students?
So yeah, I think I'm going to be doing a training with the SSRC for people who want to teach media manipulation, disinformation campaign courses syllabuses and syllabus exchanges are also very useful. It's a very new field. I mean, comm studies got a leg up, of course, on this because propaganda has been around in your scholarship for a long time. Where this field needs to go, though, which is why I was really drawn in and excited by the Just Infrastructures project, is that I think what we need is a much more interdisciplinary approach to critical internet studies. And that includes our faithful librarians, our sort of guardians of knowledge, who've really been underrepresented in this moment, because the solution to an information problem isn't more information, right? That's ludicrous. That's a business model. The solution to an information problem is sincere organization. It's some taxonomies. It's, you know, it's some good genre. You know, we need people to that come from many different backgrounds to see this problem from many different lenses and help us curate information rather than get stuck in the muck and the mire of reactionary content moderation. There is always going to be somebody wrong on the internet. Okay. There's always going to be every piece, you know, all communication comes with misinformation. The problem is we have to look at very closely what are the tactics of media manipulators? How do they spread their wares? How do they impact other information systems? And then how do we overcome it by both addressing it for what it is, but then also redesigning and restructuring for a public interest internet that gets us the web we need. And so I'm very excited about, you know, great books that have been coming out on data feminism, and because I think that if we understand the problem as one that is more than data and is not necessarily one of just bad actors, we can come together on a plan that says we care about the quality of the information that we encounter every day. And we want to really build intentionally a web that will, you know, provide us with timely, local, relevant, and accurate information on demand. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. Like, love what you're doing here. Everybody listen to Anita. Whatever she says goes. Okay. That's and happy to come back. It's the first of a few things I think we're going to be able to do together.
Joan, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you as well to our back-end production team. We want to take a quick moment to thank them and re-invite them to turn their videos on. None of this would have been possible without the back-end support of our team: Mitchell Oliver, Jingyi Gu, Vinay Koshi, Gabe Mallow, Jorge Rojas, Adrian Wong, and our ASL translators, Katrina Clark and Jeanette Ocampo Welch from UIUC's Dres office. So thank you. And thank you all in our audience today for joining us. A recording of this talk we posted on our website. Join us again. And for the next time we have Joan with us. Our next event is with Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein on data feminism on February 24th. And we hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.